Hello and welcome to SRG's Medicine. Today, in this video of Respiratory Medicine Series, we shall be talking about abnormal breathing patterns. So, the contents of this video are an overview on the respiratory control mechanism, general tips, triad of respiratory drive, eupnea, apnea, and ultimately summary. So let's start with the overview of respiratory control mechanism. So here, I'd like to clear a few basic terms before we move on to the overview. So the first term would be respiratory related neuron. So respiratory related neurons are basically a collection of interconnected neurons which are located in the brainstem region, specifically in the medulla and pons, that fire more action potential during a specific part of respiratory cycle. That means they continuously fire, however, their rate of firing increases during a specific part of the respiratory cycle. And they can be interneurons, that is the connecting neurons, or they can be premotor neurons, that is the neuron which give impulses to the motor neurons. And they can also be motor neurons. For example, we shall talk about cranial nerve number 5, 7, 9, 10, and other cranial nerves, which directly provide impulses to the motor impulses to the respiratory muscles for respiration. Now, the next term is central pattern generator. So also called as the pacemaker of the respiratory system. So they are a subset of respiratory related neurons, which are located primarily in the medulla oblongata, and they are able to independently generate a respiratory rhythm. Now, they are driven primarily by inputs from central as well as peripheral, chemo, and mechanoreceptors. However, if they are left alone, then they would tick regularly for an indefinite period of time. But these inputs, which are given from the central and peripheral chemo and mechanoreceptors, now they do not just affect or they do not drive the CPG, but rather they modulate its intensity or frequency. So they cause its modulation of the CPG. So let's move on to the overview. So here we'll start with the central pattern generator. So once the central pattern generator, let's say during a phase of inspiration, fires the impulses to the spinal cord and then via phrenic nerve to the diaphragm, or via different cranial nerve, which includes cranial nerve number 5, 7, 9, 10, 11, and 12, to the muscles of respiration, such as those of larynx, nose, abdominal muscles, or also the other chest wall muscles. Now, these impulses causes the changes in the chest wall as well as the conducting airways. Now, these changes are noted by the spinal nerves, which gives us feedback information. Furthermore, they are also detected by the cranial nerve number 10, which goes to sensory integration center located in brainstem. But now these chest wall and conducting airway changes that we see here during respiration causes increase in the ventilation. So once there is increase in the firing of the central pattern generator, there is increase in the ventilation. Now what effect do increased ventilation cause? So now that causes counteraction of the blood gas changes. So what are the blood gas changes? Hypercapnia, hypoxia, or acidemia. So these changes are counteracted by increasing ventilation, such that whenever there is increase in ventilation, carbon dioxide diffuses out from the body, leading to counteraction of the hypercapnia. Now this diffusing out of carbon dioxide causes decreased formation of carbonic acid, so decreased hydrogen ion formation, thereby causing rise in the pH and balancing of the acidemic condition. And oxygen also diffuses from the atmosphere into the arterial blood, thereby combating hypoxia. However, if these changes are not sufficient, then they activate the peripheral chemoreceptors as well as the central chemoreceptors. Now, once these peripheral and central chemoreceptors are activated, they send the impulses to the CPG. But these peripheral chemoreceptors are sensitive to all these three and can send the impulses via either cranial nerve number 9 or 10, depending upon the location. And these are gone to the sensory integration center, then only it goes to central pattern generator. However, the central chemoreceptors are sensitive only to carbon dioxide and very little to pH, but not to the oxygen level. So the central chemoreceptors, which detect the carbon dioxide level and pH of the blood, now they will send impulses to the central pattern generator if there is still imbalance in these three factors. So once there is increased rate of impulse sent to the CPG, they will again fire more impulses to the spinal cord and to the muscles of the respiratory system, thereby leading to increase in ventilation. So this is a normal respiratory control. Now here, an outsider or another player is higher CNS centers, or let's say non-respiratory related centers. Now they cause either direct impulses which are sent to the central pattern generator, or the impulses are sent to the spinal cord and then to the respiratory muscles. So these also influence the respiratory control. So that was about the overview of respiratory control. Now we'll be talking about few general tips. So tip number one, the strength of the drive from chemoreceptors, whether that be peripheral or central chemoreceptors, to the CPG or central pattern generator, causes changes in both depth as well as frequency of ventilation. So that is what we mean by modulation of its action. So modulation of action of CPG here means that it can increase or decrease both the depth as well as frequency of ventilation. Now, the receptors which detect the joint movements, that is specifically located in the muscle spindles or the joint capsules, now they help to increase the ventilation in the cases of exercise. So whenever a person exercises, then there's increase in respiratory rate, and that is due to the receptors detecting the joint movement that send the impulses to CPG. Another thing is that there is activation of pulmonary stretch receptors, which terminates in respiratory efforts, thereby preventing overinflation. So, if there was no pulmonary stretch receptors, then it would not act on excessive stretching, thereby it would not terminate overinflation. So, if there is no pulmonary stretch receptors, then we cannot stop overinflation and thereby lungs can blast. The next thing is that non-respiratory brainstem nuclei and other high centers. Now they interact with the respiratory control centers, thus allowing the ventilation to accommodate activities such as speaking, swallowing, vomiting, sleep-wake cycle, emotions, or other aspects of brain function. Now, because these different aspects like speaking, vomiting, sleep-wake cycle, etc., these require irregular breathing patterns rather than the normal inspiratory and expiratory cyclical pattern. They require irregular breathing pattern, and these irregular breathing patterns are controlled or modulated by the non-respiratory brainstem nuclei and higher centers that interact directly with the respiratory control center, specifically the central pattern generator, thus allowing the ventilation to accommodate these activities. So let's move on to the triad of respiratory drive. So what do you mean by a triad? So triad is a collection of three things. So here, a triad of respiratory drives are a collection of three factors which directly influence the respiratory drive from moment to moment via action on central pattern generator. So here we have central pattern generators which are influenced by peripheral chemoreceptors as well as central chemoreceptors. Now, these are affected by three things. Now, these triad includes oxygen level, carbon dioxide level, and pH of the arterial blood. So first, we'll talk about oxygen level. So PaO2, or let's say partial pressure of arterial blood with oxygen, or partial pressure of oxygen in arterial blood. Now, if there is presence of hypoxia, that is decrease in PaO2, then that stimulates the peripheral chemoreceptors, thereby leading to increased ventilatory drive via CPG. The next thing that we'll be talking about is PaCO2, or partial pressure of carbon dioxide in arterial blood. Now, this and pH, these two factors do not directly act upon the peripheral chemoreceptors and stimulate it, but rather they just increase the sensitivity of these peripheral chemoreceptors towards oxygen level, or let's say towards hypoxia. So they do not act directly upon the peripheral chemoreceptors, but help by increasing the sensitivity towards hypoxia. But The important fact that we need to see here is that the PaCO2 or carbon dioxide level in the arterial blood directly acts upon the central chemoreceptors. So if there's increase in the carbon dioxide level, then that leads to increased diffusion of carbon dioxide into the CSF, so increased formation of carbonic acid, and ultimately decrease in the pH, which will stimulate the central chemoreceptors. However, directly the arterial pH doesn't influence the central chemoreceptors immediately. So if there is excessive fall in pH, then only shall we see an effect of pH on the central chemoreceptors. But rather, PaCO2 can directly affect the central chemoreceptors and they are quite sensitive to carbon dioxide. So the two things that we need to note here is that PaO2, or let's say oxygen level, directly affects the peripheral chemoreceptors, thereby affecting CPG. However, PaCO2 and pH only affects the sensitivity of peripheral chemoreceptors towards hypoxia. Whereas the second thing is that PaCO2 directly acts on the central chemoreceptors. So PaCO2 level changes, then there will be changes in the stimulation of central chemoreceptors to CPG. However, pH cannot directly act upon the central chemoreceptors on a low amount. However, PaO2 or oxygen level has no direct or indirect role on the central chemoreceptors. So oxygen can affect only the peripheral chemoreceptors and carbon dioxide can directly affect central chemoreceptors, but oxygen cannot affect the central chemoreceptors, and also the PaCO2 and pH cannot directly stimulate the peripheral chemoreceptors. So this was about the respiratory drives triad. Now the next thing that I'll be talking about is about eupnea. So what is basically eupnea or a normal breathing? So it is a pattern of inspiratory and expiratory activity, which occurs under normal condition in a healthy individual. Now, these normal conditions include during non-rapid eye movement sleep, at rest, and also during mild exercise. So during these conditions, in a normal healthy individual, the pattern that we see of alternating inspiratory and expiratory activity, that is known as eupnea. So that condition is known as eupnea. And here by the term pattern, we mean both the rate and the depth. So here is a graphical representation of eupnea whereby x-axis shows the time and y-axis shows the action potential. So here you can see that there is increase in the action potential firing for a certain time, and then stopping of the action potential firing, and then again increase in the action potential firing. So we can classify this into two phases. One is inspiratory and expiratory. So the path that you can see here between these two red lines, so that is the phase where there is excessive action potential firing, that is known as inspiratory phase, whereas the phase where there is almost no action potential firing is known as expiratory phase. So that is what we can see from a graph of eupnea. Next thing that I'll be talking is about apnea. So what is actually apnea, or simply in layman terms saying as no breathing? So this means absence of ventilation for any amount of time or any length of time, which can occur in any part of the respiratory cycle, whether that be in inspiration or during expiration or between inspiration and expiration. So in any phase of the respiratory cycle, the absence of ventilation for any length of time, in the absence of cyclic drive from CPG to the respiratory muscle. So these absence of ventilation occurs due to the absence of cyclic drive from the central pattern generator to the respiratory muscle. So the condition in which there is absence of ventilation because of absence of the cyclic drive from CPG to the respiratory muscle is known as apnea. It's usually for a short term. However, if it's present for a longer amount of time, then it can be fatal. So it can be seen solely or also with other abnormal patterns of breathing, such as biotch respiration or Kussmaul's respiration, which form a important part of these patterns of respiration. So this is about apnea, and now we'll be talking on the summary of the video. Respiratory related neurons are the neurons which fire with the specific phase of respiration, whether that be during inspiration or during expiration, depending upon what the action of the respiratory related neurons is. And central pattern generators, or CPG, are the pacemakers of respiratory system or pacemakers of respiration. The three central players, or let's say triad of the respiratory drive, modulating the respiratory drive are PaO2, PaCO2, and pH of arterial blood. That is carbon dioxide level, oxygen level, and pH of the arterial blood. Eupnea is a normal pattern of breathing, which is observed in a healthy individual during rest, during NREM sleep, or during mild exercise. And apnea is a duration, which can be of varying length, of absence of ventilation, which occurs due to the absence of central respiratory drive from CPG, or central pattern generator. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed it. Please stay tuned for the upcoming videos. Once again, thank you.